may know Alastair from 14 years he served as head of Universities Scotland. He's been a frequent voice on TV, radio, the press, and in Parliament, championing the university sector's interests. Alastair was a fast-stream civil servant for 20 years before moving to the University of Glasgow, where he managed the enduring corporate turnaround. He holds a variety of non-exec roles, is an internationally published author, and leads history tours around his native Edinburgh. And most importantly, we're delighted to report that Alastair has recently joined us as a Helping Consulting Fellow. I'm going to hand over to Alastair to lead us through the webinar. There'll be time for Q&A at the end, and there's a Q&A function for you to pose your questions, so please use that as we go along. We're recording today's session, so you can share it with colleagues or watch it again after the show. So I'll hand over to Alastair.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you for your kind remarks. And also, it's great to be part of the Halpin community. So very much looking forward to supporting colleagues through that. Thank you also for the biographical introduction. What I'm going to try and bring today is a bit of experience from really having been at that interface between politicians, government, and universities through all sorts of things, including 2 constitutional referenda, goodness knows how many spending reviews, lots of cycles of legislation, and leading the interaction between universities and government through the COVID emergency. So hopefully got some relevant experience to draw on. Next slide, please. Now, what I'm going to do is try and cover some case studies. I'm just checking, can people see the slide? Oops, there we go. The case study slide, please. So what I'm going to do is cover some case studies, really to show some examples of what worked, what didn't work so well in terms of navigating that interface between higher education and politics. Obviously, the case studies are from my own experience, which, you know, while I've worked in London and Brussels as well, there's a certain Scottish bias towards them. But what I'm going to try and do is draw out general inferences about what works in influencing government and influencing politicians as we all across the United Kingdom face severe and parallel challenges. Next slide, please. So the first case study I'm going to take is about how we've managed funding campaigns and certainly what I learned from that. Now, the illustration is there, the famous handover note from Labour to Conservatives, the note to the incoming Chief Secretary of Treasury that there is no money. I suspect that the outgoing Conservatives, assuming they are outgoing, may not actually write that down this time. It has been rather held against Labour. But I think, frankly, the same message will face an incoming administration. There's no money. It's very difficult circumstances to be coming into office. Now, against that background of what now seems like kind of permanent austerity, there have been times where we've made progress. I mean, I'm extremely proud that from 2010 to 2014, I led a campaign that actually achieved a 15% increase in public funding for higher education in Scotland. I thought that was quite extraordinary that we're able to achieve that in a time of general austerity. And I think a lot founded on actually that we helped the government of the time to get it, that universities were really key to national economic prosperity and growth. I've got to be honest, it got harder after that. We had changes of political leadership, which are much more focused on social welfare than on economic growth, and that created a harder environment for us. I think we only made incremental gains in later periods. We also had a period of discussing, 2 periods in fact, of discussing whether there should be alternative funding methodologies rather than relying on core public funding for teaching university students. And we came very close at one stage to getting an alternative in Scotland, something that would have involved some degree of graduate contribution to undergraduate higher education. And that debate is one that we have also consciously reopened again over the past few months, as the public finances have got tighter and tighter, and as the prospect of significant recovery seems to recede even further. Next slide, please. So, what's my sense of what worked well and what worked less well? Well, on the what worked well side, I think we needed and succeeded to make supporting universities' contribution something that was politically high profile. We actually needed, with some honesty, to be able to portray a burning platform that actually, if government was not serious about supporting higher education, then our contribution to economic growth, our contribution to student opportunity and aspiration, and our contribution to social well-being would be fundamentally damaged. And consistent messaging that we couldn't go on starving the university sector of resource, or there would be really serious consequences for society that government would not want to see happening. And doing that actually in a way that, while portraying a burning platform, was also in some sense optimistic and respectful, that actually saying an incoming government, as it was at the time, would have the opportunity, and we hoped the will, to seriously address those issues. I don't think, let's not underestimate the opportunity that an incoming government presents to achieve some sort of reset of relationships. It was incredibly important that these messages about burning platform were not just coming from university leaders, that they were coming from our partners in the trade union movement, in the student movement, and across the business community as well. There wasn't a fixed single view from the different stakeholders about what should be done to support it, different emphases on the balance between public funding and alternative methodologies. But actually getting that broad stakeholder coalition was incredibly important, as was making sure that we're making life easier for the people who are dealing with it. Particularly, we were feeding the civil servants really good, credible, well-based factoids about our economic impact and about the contribution we're making, not just data, but also consistently feeding them lots and lots of case studies about what was being achieved for society, the economy, for our regions. And actually, there's so limited capacity within the civil service to do their own research. And what we found was that civil servants were really telling our narrative when they were briefing ministers, or when they were going out and talking about the opportunities and challenges facing Scotland. And I think one of the key things we did was make government absolutely complicit in solving the problem. We, at one stage, there was a high risk that government would just hand over a problem to us, say, well, there's a problem with higher education. How do you, higher education, solve it? And I think one of the things that made government actually feel obliged to address the issue was that they were a core part of joint work to scope what the degree of challenge facing Scottish higher education was, and therefore they couldn't walk away from the findings of that, and they felt a certain moral obligation to actually do something about it. Something very similar is actually happening in Ireland at the moment, where the universities and the government are working closely together to understand the scale of the challenge, and that makes it very difficult for government to walk away from addressing that shared view of the scale of the challenge. Next slide, please. So what worked less well? As you will no doubt be aware, we certainly didn't get a changed model of undergraduate funding in Scotland. We were very, very close, I think, to getting that. We were very close to getting something where there would be a moderate level of graduate contribution to support higher education, to support students, which I think would have given us a degree of resilience through tough financial times. But we were really knocked off course by events elsewhere in the United Kingdom. I mean, in particular, the reaction to the £9,000 fee being introduced in England, the sort of the rather bracing sights of people smashing in the doors and windows of Millbank Tower in anger at what Labour were doing, the sight of how the Liberal Democrats suffered for backing student fees in England. That actually essentially killed the prospect of any further sensible debate about it in Scotland for quite a number of years. Politicians did not want to go anywhere near something that they saw as absolutely toxic and politically destructive. The other thing that I think has become a real problem, it was less so at the beginning of this trajectory, but it's, I think, throughout a lot of the past 10 years has been that while we have had incremental year-on-year cuts, and we've wanted to push back against that, university leaders have been incredibly reluctant to actually portray public funding cuts as having a real effect on quality and on opportunity. Now, I understand that all universities are working in a competitive environment where both domestically and internationally, each institution needs to show that it's providing a high quality service that's an investable proposition and a place where international students should come and choose to spend their money. But that is very, very disabling to our ability to present universities as a priority for investment when so many other sectors are crying out for investment. I think it's something that is changing now. I've certainly been part of engineering that change in Scotland so that we're much more frank about the consequences of public underfunding. But I do think it needs real frankness from university leaders that underfunding has real and undesirable consequences for students and for society. The other thing that makes our arguments, I think, sometimes weaker is that we like to portray a burning platform. Sometimes that's true, but the platform never seems to burn through. I've found that often when I've been arguing, it feels like I've been saying, next year or a year after, there will be a catastrophe. The catastrophe has never yet happened. I think it's still possible, but to be honest, I think politicians have stopped believing that there is an imminent catastrophe because it never seems to quite happen. And frankly, politicians are being assailed by all sorts of other sectors, whether it's police, local government, health, social services, all presenting really credible cases that they're being absolutely starved of resource, and that the consequences for society of their being starved of resource are very severe and immediate. So we're working in an incredibly competitive environment. Next slide, please. So another campaign we draw lessons from is constitutional change. Now, obviously, in Scotland, this has been a big thing. I think in retrospect, we can maybe forget just how close things were in 2014. I remember sitting at the University Scottish Vice-Chancellor's away day in September 2014, shortly before the referendum, and the polling then was 52% in favour of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. There's a very, very serious prospect of that happening. In the event that the vote was 55% to 45% to stay in, which actually is remarkably close. Now, we did not face that with panic, and I think the reason we did not face that with panic was that we had done an extraordinary amount of work with both the UK government as the proponents of a status quo and the Scottish National Party administration as the proponents of change to make sure that they understood what sort of policies and what sort of structures would be necessary to support the success of Scottish higher education under either constitutional outcome. Effectively, both sides went into the the referendum, saying pretty much the same things. They were obviously very opposed about what was going to happen in the Constitution, but both of them were essentially reading from our script on how to maintain higher education success in the future. And I think that was broadly successful. I think it kept us out of being a political football. It made sure that the sector was seen to be informed but politically neutral. And as the debate re-emerged, as the SNP published new proposals for constitutional change in 2024, again, with some change, we were absolutely fundamental in informing that. So next slide, please. So what worked? The title on the right is what we published in 2014 and republished as the SNP reinvigorated the debate last year, setting out our detailed position. And that was incredibly important, that we were able to say across everything, across research, across student issues, across the regulatory framework, what we thought was necessary to maintain the success of higher education, and to see that reflected in the detailed positions of all of the proponents of all sorts of forms of status quo and change, and for what we were doing to be recognised as having real depth and integrity, being backed up by high quality legal advice, and that we were very, very clearly seen not to be a partisan interest, but a sector that was making sure that all sides of the debate were informed, and that also meant that in an issue of extremely high media concern, we had a very extensive published position to refer to. So in a very, very heightened environment, we weren't being reactive to media or to politicians when they were asking what our position was. Next slide, please. Now, this is kind of seared on my memory. I have spent far longer of my career than I would have wanted to thinking about university governance. I think university governance should be boring. Unfortunately, university governance became interesting for a period of politics in Scotland. And essentially, the dynamics of this were that the SNP administration sees everything as political, and there were a series of course closures back in the early 2010s, and that was quite high profile. That got quite a lot of traction in Scotland. The local quickly becomes national in our environment, and actually in our environment, governments are politicians so close to universities, they see almost anything that happens, even if it's the closure of a slightly failing modern languages department. They see all of that as, in some sense, a political attack on them. They don't want any trouble. They're trying to keep everyone happy, and so they want to stamp out trouble at source. And so what they did to try and stamp out trouble at source was, in their terms, to democratize university governance, i.e. to make sure that students and staff were electing a chair of governing bodies, making sure the governing bodies themselves had very high proportions of trade union staff and student membership, so that essentially it would become as difficult as possible to make the decisions that were going to lead to course closures, or going to lead to redundancies, or going to lead to anything that was going to be sort of controversial and troublesome for government in the university sector. Now, as University of Scotland, I worked for the principals, but of course the principals are accountable to the chairs of the governing bodies, and as you might expect, the reaction of chairs of governing bodies to these proposals was rather similar to the reactions of Turkey's anticipating Christmas. So we got a very, very strong mandate from the chairs through the principals that we had to absolutely oppose this democratization of university governance, to portray it as something that was absolutely fundamentally inimical to the values of universities, to portray it as something that was going to be absolutely fundamentally destructive to universities' capacity to run, And then when it was clear that government still wanted to press ahead, then essentially to stifle these proposals with love by trying to come up with our own sector-led way of managing the issue, particularly by the development of the sector-led development of a new governance code for Scottish universities, so that if we couldn't avoid anything happening, we could at least define it on our own terms. Ultimately, that wasn't fully successful. We thought we might have just been able to avoid the government choosing to spend legislative time on university governance issues, but we didn't quite get that over the line. They did legislate to create elected chairs for governing bodies and to pack governing bodies with trade union and student membership. And funnily enough, the sky didn't fall in. Remarkably little seems to have changed. So next slide, please. So here we go, the Higher Education Governance Scotland Act 2016. That's the one that introduced elected chairs and the other changes that I've just described. So what do we learn from that? Well, first of all, I think politicians really don't believe hyperbole. They hear from all sorts of different interest groups all the time that the sky's about to fall in, that something appalling is about to happen. And frankly, they treat it with a great deal of skepticism. I think in this instance, we had mobilized a lot of different groups, particularly from the learner societies, from business, from some wider stakeholder groups to say that this, particularly for instance CBI and so on, to say that these governance changes were fundamentally wrong and fundamentally inimical to universities' interests. But if I'm being honest, I think that looked to politicians who tried to present themselves as kind of centre-left or progressive. It looked a bit like a sort of a coalition of the posh, telling them that the posh were worried about these changes. So that didn't, frankly, worry politicians terribly much. And I think we found that just while there is a reservoir of support for universities and universities' contribution, that frankly, university chairs and university vice chancellors, as a community, were not a community that politicians found likable. You keep coming back to issues about senior pay, and it was interesting in Parliament that when amendments were proposed to this legislation by other interest groups, those other interest groups were quoted favourably by politicians, but when amendments were proposed on behalf of university leaders, there was a sort of strong political, well, they would say that, wouldn't they, mood in how those amendments were treated. And fatally, and I'll be honest, I blame the chairs of the time for this, we didn't build the right stakeholder coalition. Trying to do something where we were developing a new governance code in a way that didn't fully include the trade union interest was doomed from the start. We advised the chairs very strongly against that. They weren't listening, and there's an extent to which I think they got what they deserved there in terms of elected chairs being imposed on universities. But you can't really achieve everything you want to if you don't have your stakeholders as aligned as possible, not always fully possible. And also you can't achieve everything you want unless you recognize the limits of what's achievable. And particularly in this fight, the higher education sector was essentially collateral damage in a fight between the SNP and Labour to try and get the most possible support from trade unions. The SNP were actually fighting very hard and actually quite successfully at the time to win the trade unions over to their side and away from support for Scottish Labour. And I think given that overall political dynamic, our opposition to trade union interest was doomed from the start. But we did work hard. We worked hard in detail. We achieved some very important changes to legislation so that, for instance, the governing body can get rid of an elected chair that doesn't have confidence in, and so that elected chairs have to meet tightly specified criteria set by the university before it can even stand for election. So, frankly, as I say, remarkably little has changed and the sky has not fallen in. Next slide, please. I think widening access is not a good example of how to manage the political landscape. This is one where certainly in Scotland, I think it's true across the UK, the higher education sector was seen to be behind the curve by politicians, where we're getting a lot of criticism for the relatively low proportions of people from disadvantaged backgrounds coming into university, where the sector had for quite a long time, frankly, been quite defensive about how it could only do limited amounts if the problem wasn't actually being solved further up the line at school and college level. There's a truth in that. But where actually it became clear that it was politically imperative for a sector to take a bit of ownership here, that unless we could demonstrate improvement, we were seriously harming higher education's ability to be seen as an investable proposition by government, and that we're suffering real sector-wide reputational damage for lack of progress on widening access. So we took a lot of leadership here. We developed sector-wide policies on contextual admissions to make sure that people from more disadvantaged backgrounds had every possible chance to succeed in getting into university, and also that they were supported to succeed once they were in university. We developed sector-wide policy across all universities in Scotland on admissions policy and on how admissions policy would be communicated to learners. We did a lot of detailed work with the colleges to improve the pathways from college to university across Scotland, and we made important specific sector-wide commitments to the treatment of disabled and care experienced applicants to university to make sure that they were given every possible chance to enter and succeed at university. And that was really fundamental. Again, government has got very, very limited capacity to do stuff. There may seem to be an awful lot of civil servants, but they are actually quite overstretched. And just stepping in, I think, really creatively and filling that vacuum with our own action and with our own policy making, I think was incredibly important, both reputationally and substantively. Next slide, please. So where next? My goodness me, there are plenty of challenges. I think across all the jurisdictions, we're all facing severe funding challenges as the unit of resource per student erodes, whether it's paid for from fees or whether it's paid for from core public funding. Across the UK, the PIPs are really squeaking. I think the English student fees model, I've got to be honest, it's hard to engineer your way out of it. I think everyone sees it's not really working as well as it should. I think we've kind of lost sight, frankly, I think, of how weird the English fees model is, just how bizarre an international outlier it is, especially as you look across Europe, to have such a high contribution expected from students / graduates, and to have regressive elements of how that is repaid by graduates. I think we forget also the very weird circumstances in which this was introduced in the early days of the Conservative Lib Dem coalition. And from my slightly cynical perspective, the extent to which a £9,000 fee was a deliberate and successful attempt by the Conservatives to direct Liberal Democrats by getting them to sign up to something that was repugnant to what they promised in the manifesto. So it's an odd thing. It's a weird international outlier, but it's a very hard thing to design your way out of once you're in. So I don't underestimate the challenge there. And my goodness, the culture wars have been horrible. All the Mickey Mouse degrees nonsense. But I think actually wider perceptions from politicians across the spectrum that perhaps from their perspective, I don't agree with it, but from their perspective, there are too many students in higher education, that the expansion, since frankly driven by the fees model, has not necessarily helped everyone, and a strong sense, I think, cross-party, that we need to provide more opportunities for higher technical learning and better opportunities for learners who aren't going to go to university. Regulation, it's not going to go away. I do think that the way OFS is behaving at the moment is a kind of manifestation of the culture wars, and of particular conservative preoccupations. So hopefully a different administration will either want a different regulator or a regulator that behaves differently. That would be an immense relief. But I do think whatever administration we have, government is going to want to support the student interest above the university leadership interest. For instance, with potentially taking up suggestions that universities should have an enhanced duty of care towards students. And I think any government is also going to press very, very hard on demonstration of value for money in return for public funding, in ways that the sector might say is inimical to autonomy, but I think, frankly, are absolutely inevitable when you've got any administration that's trying to manage a limited resource and assure itself that you're getting the best value from that resource. International policy, Labour have not been particularly helpful recently, in a sense that their previous quite open rhetoric about international students and their contribution, I kind of feel over the past few months, as they've been competing with the Conservatives in a pre-election environment, that Labour has been sounding tougher on immigration than it used to. But I don't think they've got the same essential instincts as parts of the Conservative Party. I think they do have a decent appreciation of the contribution of international students to our society and economy. And, thank heavens, latest Migration Advisory Committee report at least a kind of, I think, sets a baseline beyond which we may not get worse in terms of restriction on international entitlement, international student entitlement. So hopefully we've kind of hit the bottom of how difficult it's going to be from a government regulatory perspective to compete in international markets. Touching wood there. I think there are real problems, obviously, as everyone's facing up to really, really tough financial circumstances about how do you actually do the cuts, how do you do restructuring and redundancies in ways that actually support the sector and the institution's long-term resilience and excellence. There are huge dangers, obviously, that decisions are made that actually bring long-term damage to resilience and excellence. And I think that's the subject of the next Halpin seminar. So I'll be very interested to join in that and learn from others on that. And again and again and again, I think the thing has been brought home to me in my career is politicians do not care about institutional financial sustainability. I've sat around so many meetings with vice chancellors, sadly lamenting that times are tough and the bottom line looks bad. They might be going into deficit, and politicians don't seem to care. Well, they don't. They think it's basically university management's job to balance the books, and they should be exercising creativity about that. While they care about university contribution, they don't really, in the abstract, care about university financial sustainability. Next slide, please. But they do care about what universities contribute. Politicians are surprisingly grounded. They're out there understanding what's happening in their constituencies all the time. They're out there talking to people who are suffering or adverse life experiences or who are expressing their aspirations. And they really, really do care about what opportunities there are for their constituents. And what I hear from their constituents is a bit different from the rhetoric that sometimes comes out. Frankly, if you ask most parents what they ideally want for their kids, it's for the good opportunity by going to university. So, I think while some of the political rhetoric has been very much about let's have more apprenticeships fewer students, I think there is actually an opportunity there that actually the on-the-ground messages that politicians are often getting are actually, everybody ideally wants a kid to get a good education and a good job, and many parents see university as a core part of that. So I think there's something to capitalize on there. And likewise, while they might not care about universities' financial condition in the abstract, they do hugely care about the jobs that universities generate, both directly and indirectly in their constituencies, and the economic impact of universities. So while some of the rhetoric has been that universities may be allowed to fail, I think when push comes to shove, especially when you look at the more vulnerable economic regions of the United Kingdom, I think a university failure is something that actually politicians would go a long way to avoid if they could, because of its impact on the regional economy. And politicians are always very wary of, they would say that, wouldn't they? Hearing an interest group say what they expect an interest group to say. But I do think there's an opportunity. I do think we've got a fantastic capacity across the sector to mobilize third-party stakeholders, to mobilize other regional economic actors, to mobilize business, frankly, to mobilize trade union and student voices in ways that have not always been done, to actually speak up for the sector contribution and how that needs to be supported. I think all parties are incredibly interested in the whole post-16 education picture, and having the right opportunities available across further and higher education and work-based learning, and in seeing a much greater integration of these opportunities and a much greater flexibility of when and where people can learn at different stages in their community, so at different stages in their career. So I think there are huge opportunities there for the sector to show itself, genuinely as being creative in that space of having joined up opportunities with colleges, with work-based learning, with apprenticeships, with upskilling and reskilling to meet people's diverse needs at diverse stages of their career. And a new government gives an opportunity for a reset. I mean, look at what's happening in Australia with the Australian Universities Compact. I think there are opportunities with a new administration just to take a step back and actually try and co-define with that administration what do they really want from the university sector. And in doing that, as I said before, to make the incoming administration really complicit in delivering what it has said with the sector that it wants from universities' contribution. And let's always make sure we're remembering that the influence is not simply about evidence. I mean, a lot of our university leaders come from an academic background. They've been schooled in the importance of evidence. And frankly, this is not necessarily the environment we're working in. If you want to be influential, it's as much about emotion as it is about evidence. So if we can grab politicians, if we with our stakeholders can grab politicians, tell them great stories, get them out seeing fantastic stuff, get them out seeing what a transformational impact universities are making on the local economy, how we're transforming people's individual opportunities. The more we can, they are people, the more we can grab them by the emotions, and the more we can work with our stakeholders in grabbing them by the emotions, the more chance we have of actually having successful influence and seeing universities' success supported by the incoming administration. So I'll stop there. I hope I've left enough time for remarks and questions, and thank you very much indeed.
Great, thank you very much, Alastair, for a fascinating webinar. We're going to move into some questions. We've got a few questions that people have sent in before the webinar, and now's your time, if you've got a question, to post it in the Q&A section. So the first question I've got is, what are the odds that a Labour government will address the university funding challenges? Is this really on their agenda?
Yes, but in a rather vague and unspecific way. I think what are Labour saying? They are acknowledging, I think, in their own words, that there is a crisis in university funding. They are saying that they want to create a secure future for higher education. They're incredibly unspecific about the means of doing that. And from my point of view, that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity, a bit like kind of the Australian opportunity, to actually get in there post-election and say, well, what do you really mean by this? Can we co-create what you really mean by this? I think it's an opportunity that we would have to seize in a way that recognizes that their first focus is going to be on the student rather than the institution, and on economic contribution, and that frankly they don't have a lot of money to play with. But can we be creative within that envelope? I think creative in ways that acknowledge that Labour are interested in that whole connectivity of lifelong learning and that whole connectivity between colleges, universities, and work-based learning. There's not going to be an abundance of public funding, but I actually genuinely think there's a creative space there for thinking about where do we go next and where do we go next in a way that improves the connectivity between different parts of further and higher education and work.
Great, thank you. And what can the sector do? What are the practical steps that you want to see the sector undertaking to position itself with the Labour government to get some kind of cut through? Because there's going to be so much noise and so much attention seeking. What could the sector be doing?
My personal instinct is that this has really got to be help us to help you. I think an incoming government of any complexion is going to have very limited headspace. And a bit like what I was saying on how we manage to solve the widening access problems, the more that we can be creating an environment where we are licensed to come up with solutions and co-develop those solutions with government, I think the further we're likely to get. I think you could wait a long time for government to do something creative. I think you're going to be so stretched on so many fronts. But I think if the sector is going in there to a new administration saying, look, here's some things we want to talk about, here's some areas where we think there's a possibility for creative policy co-development, and frankly, with an offer to do quite a lot of the heavy lifting on the policy co-development, I think there's an opportunity to influence, because I think politicians are going to want to grab with two hands anything that actually looks like sensible and creative policy influence that's well aligned with what they're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. We've got a question from Will Kitchen who says, given the impracticality of democratising governance and the importance of emotion as well as evidence, are you aware of any action plans or models which might enable stronger stakeholder coalition, making effective use of the potent feelings generated by the financial pressures faced by staff and students to strengthen HE's relationship with government? Any successful or promising case studies?
Right, case studies. I think a lot of the best case studies have been things that have emerged from the city and the region deals. I mean, the case studies that I've seen have been really, really fundamental. Particularly, I've seen a lot happening in Glasgow, where city and region deals have been used to co-create between UK government, devolved government, local government, the university, and business, sort of real developments of scale that have brought new economic opportunity to deprived parts of Glasgow. They've created new university facilities, for instance, across in Govan, which is a pretty deprived community, new community spaces, opening up the university to actually be a community resource, creating new streets, creating new facilities for people to use. I've seen that across various parts of the country, and if you look at where was I last in Manchester, if you look at the sort of absolutely transformational effect on Manchester of having great universities there, making a leading student city, continual investment in new facilities. I think there's huge opportunities. I think politicians are not daft. They walk the ground. They see all this. So I think as long as we are having an engagement that's not sort of about institutional self-interest, but that is actually about creating these fantastic new social and economic opportunities in our regions, then I think, particularly if there continues to be some sort of support for things that have been done through city and region deals, and even their own small way through levelling up, then I think that this is an area of real opportunity.
Right, thank you. And following that line, what if you're sat in an individual institution? What are the practical things you could start doing now to have more productive relationships with your local politicians, or is now just not the time? Do we have to wait?
Obviously, here we are right in the election period, but looking beyond that, I am consistently astonished by the power of anecdote. That actually so many politicians' worldview is formed by what they've seen, not what they've read. They got, God knows how many thousands of pages of bump every week from people who are trying to influence them. Some nuggets of that will stay with them, but probably not very much. But the thing that stays with them is what they've seen, the people they've met, and telling a story to a politician that a politician then retells. And so, yeah, for me, the fundamental is getting their feet on the ground, getting them out, seeing the brilliant stuff you're doing, but also seeing the buckets under the roof. There has been a bit of a problem that politicians have kind of always gone around smelling of fresh paint on the buildings that have just been opened. I think they also need to be brought out to walk the beat to see that the roof's leaking, to see that we're operating in some crap 1960s buildings, to see that there are important ways in which what we can do is being constrained in a way that's not good for students and not good for regional economic contribution. So yeah, give them the balanced picture, but within that balanced picture, give them something to enthuse about. I've been consistently astonished at how one good case study can be of something they've seen and experienced can be absolutely transformative to their worldview.
Right, thank you. And you touched on it in your presentation. Will the Labour government allow a university to go bankrupt? Is this and is this on their worry list?
It may well be on their worry list. I don't think I would find it. I think they would probably do everything they could not to. But it might you might end up with institutional mergers, for instance. I think as always, I think their focus would be on the student interest, making sure that students have a continued opportunity. I don't think they're particularly precious about whether a particular university continues to exist. As long as the students are being supported and as long as there is still a university doing the things there that deliver the local employment and regional impact. So I don't think they were particularly fussed if the nameplate on the door changed and the university became part of a larger enterprise. But I think they'd be seriously worried about a sort of catastrophic failure that actually saw a university, its students, its employment, its economic impact disappear rather than potentially being managed in a different way in a different institutional setup.
Yeah, absolutely. And why should we be feeling hopeful now? What are the things that we should hold on to give us hope at the moment?
I think that so many people value what universities do. I think the fact that so many parents want that for their kids and politicians are hearing that. I think the fact that so many politicians recognize that universities are just a fundamental part of our regional, social, and economic fabric. I do think that is actually now quite broadly realised. I think a lot of people do. I think the case in research is probably less deeply understood, but I think most politicians do understand that universities doing stuff that hopefully is important to things like achieving our just transition to net zero. But I think a case is still, I don't think that's as deeply internalized by politicians. But yeah, I think a genuine sense that we are, an important part of meeting aspirations, an important part of the fabric of economy and society. And my goodness me, it's over optimistic. Maybe austerity is not permanent. Seems semi-permanent. But let's hold on to that sort of vestige of hope that in a few years' time we might again be on a trajectory of economic growth and a slightly rising tide. I've always been, it's almost inevitable at the moment, I've always been a little wary about making decisions now that permanently reduce capacity and can't be recovered from when we see a period of economic recovery. It's got to come sometime. I suppose I've just been around long enough to see economic cycles. This seems to be, we seem to be out of a cycle into a sort of permanent down at the moment, but it can't last forever, surely.
Absolutely. And we do a lot of work on governance reviews, and you talked about university governance. What should governing bodies be worrying about at the moment? What should they be thinking about in terms of how they can support political positioning of universities?
That's interesting. I've been to I've done a lot of work with chairs and done a lot of work that's involved sort of sitting in on university governing body discussions. Maybe it's a bit banal, but I'm going to say two things. One is, yes, of course, the fundamental duty of the governing body is to ensure the sustainability of the institution, and they've got to be always having their eyes on that, and that requires such intense focus during what really is a bit of a time of crisis at the moment in terms of the funding coming into universities. But also, I would say, not losing sight of what the university is for, not losing the sight of the fact that the university is not a PLC. The university is an educational charity, and that the decisions that they make now about how to navigate a university through tough times have got to be decisions that are true to the institution's values, true to its charitable mission, that they're looking to that wider picture, that they're not just looking at institutional sustainability, they're looking at how to make decisions that support that institution to be a collaborative actor with other parties, with other universities, with colleges, with business, and actually being part of creating a prosperous and inclusive society. I mean, if I'm being honest, sometimes I've sat around the table and felt that everything is on the bottom line. I can really understand why that is the focus at times of particular stress. But every decision really has to be informed by values and mission.
Absolutely. And what's going to happen next week and with the election then? What's your prediction? Leave us with a final thought on that.
Oh my goodness. Well, we've all been told not to bet, haven't we? So
that's it. No betting allowed. Well, you're allowed to bet.
I mean, I think it's going to be, it's very hard not to see a comprehensive Labour victory. I don't think it's going to be much of a honeymoon period. I think they're just, there are so many issues, there's so many financial pressures, so little immediate scope to alleviate those financial pressures, such a sort of backlog of expectations on government. I think it's going to be a really, really tough first period for Labour, even with a huge majority. I would like, a bit like Australian Universities Compact, maybe I would like the university sector to be right in there as a creative partner, not just asking for stuff, but saying, here's how we think we can co-create with you the ways in which, within the financial envelope was available, which we'd like to expand for universities, obviously, the ways in which we can co-create inclusion and prosperity.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I think that brings us nicely towards a close. And thank you, Alastair, for a fascinating webinar. We're really delighted you've joined us as a consulting fellow, and we look forward to working with you on a variety of governance and strategy projects over the coming year. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. We hope you'll join us for our next webinar, which is Making Tough Choices. Is it possible to make financial savings without causing operational harm? There's a thorny subject for us to dig into. Our panel of consulting fellows will bring together experience in finance, human resources, planning and operational management. And together they'll explore that challenging subject. That webinar takes place on the 10th of July at lunchtime. There's details in the chat box now, so you can get registered for that. And all our webinars, like today, are recorded, so you can share them with colleagues or listen to them again when at your leisure. And thank you very much, Alastair.
Thank you.